Hi, my name is Erica from Five Little Monsters, and I'm doing a series of videos to teach people how to crochet. My last video, I talked about different kinds of crochet hooks and other tools that you might need to get started crocheting. Today we're going to be talking about yarn. I have a variety of different kinds of yarn here, and I kind of wanted to just talk about how to know what kind of yarn is the right yarn for the project that you're going to be doing. The first thing I wanted to talk about is yarn weights, or the thickness of yarn. You can see there's a big variety in the thickness of yarn that you can find. You can find thin yarns. This is a really fine yarn, or a really bulky yarn like this. And different projects are going to call for different kinds of yarn. Here I have some squares that I made, and each of these squares is made using a different size of yarn. And you can tell the difference between how big or how small they are based on just using a different kind of yarn. So it's really important when it comes to making a project, because if you have a project and it calls for a yarn that's this thickness, and you try to use a yarn that's even this thickness, you're going to come out with a really small hat or something that's not going to be the right size. So how do you know what size your yarn is? I'm going to grab this skein. Yarn has on its label, there's all these little symbols here. And this one right here tells us that this yarn is a super bulky yarn, or a number 6 category yarn. Whereas this one, it is a number 1 category, or super fine yarn. So the categories range from 1 typically to 6. I think I've seen some that may go up to a 7, but 6 is super bulky, 1 is super fine. I think 2 is fine. 3 are going to be your lightweight yarns. 4s are going to be your medium weight yarns, and 5s are bulky. So I'm going to kind of just show the difference between each of those different types of yarn. So we'll start with this square. This is made with this yarn, which, like I said, is a 6 or bulky, super bulky weight yarn. And for each of these little samples, they also have a recommended hook size. Now, this is not always the size that you're going to use for patterns that are made with this type of yarn, but it's kind of a starting place. So this one recommends an M, or 13 9mm hook. And so what I did is I did 12 rows of 12 single crochet. And for this particular yarn, that's the size that it came out, making a square out of 12 rows of 12 single crochet. The next size down is this one, which is a 5 or bulky weight yarn. And again, you can see here the recommended hook size. It actually is the same as the other one, but it's a little bit thinner yarn. Grab the other one again, and you can see the difference in the weight. This one's a little bit thinner than that one. So again, I crocheted 12 single crochet, 12 rows of it, and this is the square that I ended up with. You can see that there's definitely a difference in the size of those squares. So you can see why it would be important if you're crocheting a hat and the pattern called for this yarn, but if you were to decide to substitute this yarn, your hat's going to be really big, or vice versa. It would be really small if it was supposed to be made with the bigger yarn. The next weight category is a medium weight yarn, or number 4. I used this yarn. This is a really common weight of yarn. This is what I use for a lot of my projects, especially for when I make like amigurumi and things like that. I usually use the number 4. It's just really kind of probably the most commonly used yarn. At least it's what I use most frequently. But you can see, again, it's a little bit smaller than the one before it. So you can see how each weight category makes a smaller square. Next I have this yarn, which is a baby yarn. and it is in the lightweight category, or the number 3 weight. And again, you can see here where it has its recommended hook size. So I made a square out of that yarn, this little gray square here. And again, it's a little bit smaller than the last square. This one, I don't have the label on this yarn, but it was the only number 2 category yarn that I had. And I looked online to see what the hook size was, so that I made sure that I used, for each of these, I've used the recommended hook size just to keep everything even and the same, so I could make a good comparison. So again, there's definitely a little bit smaller size difference there. And then last we have the super fine yarn. This is a sock yarn. Yeah, so it's sock weight yarn. And it's really thin. So for that one, I made this square. And again, you can see it's just a little bit smaller than the square before it. Each of these yarns within the categories also have other names that you may hear. Like, for example, within the number 4 weight category, the medium weight category, like this type, you may hear it be called worsted weight yarn or Aran weight yarn. There's still a variety of different sizes within that category. So not every yarn that says it's a number 4 or medium weight yarn is going to be the same size. So you still have to be careful, but that's just kind of a good starting point. If you know you need a worsted weight yarn or a medium weight yarn, this is the type of yarn that you're going to go with. Just to kind of show you an example of how even yarn within the same weight category can vary quite a bit, I have these 2 skeins of yarn. These are both really common brands that are easy to find, and they both happen to be number 4 in their weight category. Oh, this one it got ripped off, but you can see where it says medium, or you can see it in Spanish at least. But both of these are considered a number 4 weight category. However, you will see that there is definitely, if you compare them side by side, there is a difference in weight. They are not the same size. And also you can look and see, it tells you the gauge in these things where it has a recommended size. It tells you to get a 4" by 4" gauge swatch, you'll probably do 13 single crochet, 14 rows with a size H hook. That's the gauge for that one. And if you look at this one, you're going to use an I hook to get their gauge of 4 by 4, 12 single crochet by 15 rows. So they are not going to give you the same size of stitches, even though they're the same weight category. And to show an example of that, this is the swatch that I made for my number 4 weight yarn, and I used this yarn here. However, I made another one using this yarn with its recommended hook size, and if I line those up, you can see that they are not the same size. I've made the mistake in the past thinking, well, they're both a number 4 weight category, so they should be the same. They should make the same size of thing. And I made a baby size hat one time, and it called for a yarn that was similar to this. I think it was a different brand, but it was similar in size, and I used this brand. And my newborn hat might have fit a preemie, but it was pretty small. So you need to be careful making sure that you pick the right yarn for your project. Sometimes it's not as big of a deal because some projects, the size may not be as crucial. Like for example, with a scarf, maybe your scarf will be just a little bit thinner, but it won't be a huge deal. But if you're making something that needs to fit a certain way, you want to make sure that you use the right yarn. Another thing that you're going to want to consider when you're choosing a yarn to work with is the fiber content. A lot of these yarns that I've used as examples today are acrylic yarns. Right here you can see it says 100% acrylic. This one also says 100% acrylic. But there are other yarns as well. For example, this yarn is 50% wool, 50% acrylic, so it's a blend. There are also cotton yarns. You can see this one is 100% cotton. And for some projects, cotton yarn is going to be better than an acrylic yarn. For other projects, you may want a different kind of yarn. I've used yarns that have alpaca in them that are a little bit more fuzzy. This yarn, you can see, has a metallic thread through it, so it gives it a little bit of a sparkle. This yarn is a blend of a lot of different things. It's got acrylic, polyester, wool, and nylon. And it also has a sparkly thread running through it, and it's kind of got a very different texture than some of the other yarns. So depending on what project you're making, you'll want to choose a different yarn based on what that particular project needs. So using these two yarns as an example, cotton yarn and this acrylic yarn, I made a swatch of each of those. They're similar in size because they both happen to be a number 4 medium weight category. They're similar in the sizes that they are. I don't know how well you can really tell, but the stitches look a little bit different just because of the fiber of the yarn. This yarn's a little bit fuzzier, and this yarn is a little bit stiffer. You can kind of see each stitch in this yarn just a little bit better. I use cotton yarn for anything that's going to be like kitchen stuff, like for example dishcloths or dish towels, or even I like it for like coasters, placemats, things that are going to get maybe wet or heavier use. I like to use that. I don't particularly care for cotton yarn for things like clothing items. Some people do, and there are some types of cotton yarn that have a little bit more drape than this particular one. This one's kind of stiff, and I just don't think it works as well for that kind of stuff, but it works great for things like dish towels or dishcloths. I typically use acrylic yarn just because it's pretty readily available. It's available in, I mean, you can get tons of different options with acrylic yarn in craft stores and things like that. Blends are also nice because you get some of the benefits of like wool, but without scratchiness that may come along with wool and things like that. Another thing to consider when you're choosing a yarn is your washing instructions. On the label, it will give you instructions. There will be all these little washing symbols, and it'll also tell you, like this one is machine washable and dryable. But you shouldn't iron it because it's acrylic and it will melt. This particular one, it says hand wash warm and dry flat. So because of the wool content in this, if you wash it in a washing machine, it could shrink or change the size of it. Most of the yarns that I use, I tend to use machine washable yarns. This one is also machine washable, and it is a combination of superwash wool and rayon and nylon. I mostly try to choose yarns that are machine washable. That's just kind of my preference. It really depends on what they're going to be used for. I like to be able to wash things like baby blankets because they get a lot of use and they get dirty. You're using them for a baby, so I like to be able to throw them in the wash. Some things I may still tell people to hand wash or to not dry, but that is definitely something to consider when you're choosing a yarn. The last thing I wanted to cover is choosing colors. Obviously, you can choose whatever color you want to use for your project. You don't have to go with a specific color, but there are some different options when it comes to colors. This would be an example of a solid yarn, obviously. Just one color all the way throughout. No changes, nothing different there. This yarn is an example of a variegated yarn. And if you kind of unwind some of it, you can see that it has several different colors in it. So this light blue color goes for a little ways. Then it changes to purple, then to navy, and the navy's got a little longer section in this particular one. Then a short section of purple, and then back to light blue, and it also has white in it. So they're relatively short color changes. You're only going to have a few stitches in each color. Here is an example of what that looks like worked up just in single crochet. And the colors are just kind of wherever they end up. There are ways to use this yarn, sometimes depending on the way that the colors lay, to get certain patterns, to get like an argyle look or things like that. But if you're just using it in a regular pattern, just be aware that the colors are going to be kind of random. This yarn also has a variety of colors in it, but if we pull it out a little bit, you'll notice that it has longer sections. This is all green, and I already used some of the green, and then it turns to a blue, and all of this is going to be that light blue color. And then just before I get to where I stopped pulling out, it starts to turn to a darker blue. So this one has longer color changes. They're not super long, but it's going to give you a more striped effect. And this particular one is because it's a sock yarn, it's supposed to turn out more like that. And you can see in my sample swatch that I worked up that I did hit a color change, so it did give me kind of a striped effect. So a little bit different than like this, where the colors are just changing constantly, even in the middle of a row. Like this row, I've got a couple white stitches, a few blue stitches, some purple stitches, and some navy blue stitches, whereas this one, it was like green for several rows, and then this white pink color for several rows. This yarn, it might be kind of hard to tell, but you can sort of tell in some of these areas that it's got an ombre color effect, where it goes from dark to light. And there are also some yarns that are going to do something like that. This one has also longer color changes, so it's going to be a more gradual shift from dark to light and then back. Another thing that's really popular, and I didn't grab any examples of this right now, are the cake yarns. Things like Caron Cakes and Bernat Pop and Sweet Rolls that have long color changes, so they'll give you more of a color blocked or striped effect on your project. Those are all just things to consider as you're choosing which kind of yarn is right for your project that you're making. Once you know what size of yarn you need, what weight category it's in, and you can find that same yarn that the pattern calls for, or something that's going to be comparable in weight and size and in gauge, or how many stitches per inch, then you can choose a yarn that's going to work for you. Knowing what kind of fiber content, whether it's wool, cotton, acrylic, whatever works for that particular project. And then also making sure that the colors that you choose work for the project, not choosing a really busy yarn for a really complex stitch, and just knowing what's going to work for the project that you've chosen. If you have any more questions about yarn, or there's anything else that you'd like to know, feel free to contact me. You can comment here on the video, you can email me, or you can comment on my blog, and I will try to answer any questions that I get. Next, we'll be learning how to start crocheting. We're going to actually get started. Now that we've talked about tools and yarn, we're ready to get started. So I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks. Bye.